I was taken to an underground orphanage where all the toys were alive. My parents died when I was young. The house fire that murdered them also destroyed everything we owned, every picture of our family, every heirloom, and every memento. To this day, I can barely remember my parents' faces. Thinking back, it all seems like a blur, like a ghostly image of a mother and father without features or expressions. My brother Alex, who was only 9 at the time, managed to carry me out of the house. He was hailed as a hero, and the story played on the local news. It managed to draw the attention of a small local toy company called Bittaker's Toys. They had a small orphanage next to their toy company. In hindsight, it was probably all some tax-deductible scheme to make themselves look good, among other things. I remember a police officer with a tight, grim expression on his face coming into my hospital room after the fire. His dark eyes looked ancient and haunted, as if he were 100 years old. "I've got good news, little buddy," he said, patting me on the shoulder without smiling. I glanced up at his flat eyes. They shone like new copper pennies. "Larry Bittaker himself has volunteered to adopt you and your brother. You're going to live at Toyland." I frowned at him, a small boy in an extremely large hospital bed. I drew the sheets up to my neck pensively, using them like a shield. What's a Toyland?" I asked nervously. I looked at his uniform, seeing a name tag there reading Sergeant Bowley. I somehow knew at that moment that I would see this man again. I don't know if I believe in psychic powers or anything, but I had a sudden flash of pale, bloodless faces, men shouting in the middle of chaos and bloodshed, and a blurry silhouette of someone in a police uniform running in with dead eyes. I blinked, and it evaporated like a mirage. "You've never heard of Toyland?" Sergeant Bowley asked, staring at me without blinking. "It's a place where kids go when they don't have a family, I guess. All the kids there are adopted or orphans. They have a private school and everything. It's really one of the best case scenarios for you and your brother." I nodded. Even as a small child, a creeping suspicion came over my mind. Was he trying to convince me or himself? We were taken to Toyland the next morning. Sergeant Bowley drove my brother Alex and me to the orphanage. As we pulled in, Alex put a thin arm around my shoulders, hugging me close. "It's going to be okay, Herbie," he whispered. His blue eyes were wide and uncertain as we surveyed the complex. He was scarecrow thin, and the trauma and horror of the last few days still gleamed darkly behind his eyes. The complex was ringed by a black metal fence with sharp points like spears emerging from the top. A brightly colored building loomed overhead, its walls covered with fluorescent day-glow murals showing happy children playing with toys that were alive. Roosters and lizards with humanoid bodies and sharp, pointed teeth played on playgrounds in the murals with smiling children. Teddy bears with very human-like fingers and toes climbed trees with excited children. The children's mouths were all open and silently wailing, though whether in screams of pleasure or of fear, I couldn't yet tell. The building had countless smokestacks on the top of its flat roof, each billowing out clouds of black smoke into the air. An enormous sign on top of the building read, "Bittaker's Toys." A black-clad guard in a guardhouse ambled slowly over to the car, leaning down close to Sergeant Bowley's face. I couldn't hear what they said through the divider in the police car, but the guard had a grim, set expression on his face. As the gate slid open and we drove past, I realized the guard had what looked like a small arsenal on his belt, holding 2 pistols and dozens of magazines. "Why does that man need so many guns?" I whispered in the back seat. Alex shook his gaunt face. "They probably just keep a lot of important stuff and money here," he said. "Oh," I muttered as the police car slowly pulled up to the entrance, a tall archway with 2 swinging glass doors. All along the front of the building stood tall animatronic creatures, 6-foot-tall teddy bears with huge black eyes and humanoid roosters with blade-like cones extending from the tops of their pointed heads. They all stood as straight as soldiers, staring ahead in an unblinking, statuesque way. I don't know if they were supposed to look cute, but as a young boy, they appeared terrifying and unnatural. Their mouths stayed straight and expressionless. They had an eerie, uncanny valley feeling to them. "What are those?" I asked Sergeant Bowley as he opened the door. Alex and I slid out, carrying all of our worldly goods in 2 small plastic bags. The fire destroyed everything we owned except for the clothes on our backs, after all. Some charities had given us toiletries and a couple of pairs of clothes. I held it protectively against my body, afraid that someone would try to take away the last possessions I owned. You don't know the Smiling Buddies? About Barry Bear and Mino the Minotaur, he said, surprised. Well, you'll learn about them inside. I thought kids loved that kind of stuff. Our parents didn't really give us a lot of toys, Alex said. They used to send us outside to play. Ah, well, that's the best way, Sergeant Bowley said in a fatherly manner as he escorted us toward the building. Once we had gotten within a few steps of the bizarre animal mannequins, they came to life. Their eyes suddenly glowed with a pale, inner light that stayed far down in the black orbs with an eerie cataract gleam. With a whirring of gears and a grinding of metal, their heads ratcheted over to face us. Their slack, vacant mouths erupted into wide grins, showing square teeth that gleamed with a silvery luster. Their movements were simultaneous and choreographed, like those of synchronized dancers. As one, they raised their right hands into the air in what was probably intended to be a wave, but in reality, it looked more like a Sieg Heil salute. Their mouths chattered as a song rang out all around us from hidden speakers, but the movements of their jaws didn't exactly match the words, increasing the uncanny valley feeling of the entire thing. They started dancing and twisting their bodies in a strange kind of jitterbug dance. Welcome, girls and boys. Come to the land of toys, where nothing is as it seems. A place where a child's dreams can rise to the purest joys, and where the nighttime screams of the shadow that destroys fade away to nothing, leaving only the smiles of spring. As soon as the song had finished, the animatronic's arms fell limply down, the light in their eyes fading back to blackness. With a final whirring of gears, they straightened back up into their soldierly postures and went quiet. Silently, the three of us went inside. We walked through the swinging doors into a lobby where the floor was paved with black and white squares of gleaming marble. Long wooden tables ran perpendicular to the front wall, covered with computer monitors and TVs. Huge statues of toys surrounded us on all sides. An extremely fat man stood in the center of the empty chamber. His clothes were all bright day glow colors, fluorescent orange pants, and a bright yellow button-up long-sleeve shirt that showed the curly hairs on his chest. His head was shaved, and his scalp gleamed like a fleshy egg. Welcome, kiddos, he said in a high-pitched, feminine wheeze as sweat trickled down his beet-red face. He took a step toward us. His lips were thick and moist. In a moment, they rose into a wide smile, showing off rows of small, straight teeth. My name is Larry Bittaker, and this is my toy company. But it is so much more. It's a place where sweet little children like you can live and grow forever if you want. Slowly, Larry Bittaker lowered his fat face until it was only inches from mine. His many chins jiggled as he knelt down. His stubby, sweaty fingers came up and pinched my cheek. His beady, blue eyes reminded me of those of a pig. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then he turned to Alex, ruffling his overgrown bowl cut. Okay, kids, be safe. Larry, I'm going to get off, Sergeant Bowley said, slowly stepping back from the pig-like man kneeling on the ground in front of him. Here's my card, by the way, if you kids ever need anything. He reached into his pocket, giving me and Alex copies of his business cards. I stared down at it, confused. No one had ever given me a business card before. It had his name and private phone number on it. I heard Sergeant Bowley turn and walk out the door. And then Alex and I were alone with the toy maker. Larry Bittaker seemed to be the only one in the warehouse. We walked past corridors filled with empty toys and staring animatronics. Larry filled the air with his ramblings the entire time. You kids are really going to love it here. I guarantee it, he said with exuberance. The other boys and girls are waiting for you downstairs. They're so excited to see new friends come in a steep metal staircase spiraled down into the darkness. I grabbed Alex's hand nervously, looking up at Larry Bittaker. Well, go on, little ones. Aren't you coming with us? I asked in a small voice. Larry gave a boisterous laugh, his protuberant stomach jiggling like jello as his face grew even redder. Oh, no, he said. I don't go down there. The little ones tend to smell like poverty. His face drew close to mine. In fact, I can smell it on you right here. I backed away from the strange man. Alex's small face formed into a scowl. You can't talk to us like that, he said defiantly, puffing his little bird's chest out. If you two little shitheads don't start going down those stairs now, I'll throw you down them, Larry Bittaker growled, his porcine face melting into a sneer. The mask of the genial businessman had disappeared, and something cold and dark revealed itself. Glancing backward, Alex and I started down the spiral staircase, descending into the blackness. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw the gleam of blood-red emergency lights. They illuminated what looked like an enormous maze. As soon as we had gone past the threshold, a hidden door slammed behind us, cutting off the last of the white light overhead. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the metal door smashed closed with a ringing sound. What is this place? Alex asked in a small voice. I followed close at his heels. Where are the other kids? Maybe they're all hiding, I said, hopefully. Maybe it's all a big game. Alex looked doubtful. Come on, Herbie, he said, with deep-socketed eyes the color of ashes. Nowhere to go but forward. The silence rang out around us like a shriek. I could hear my own heart beating loudly in my ears. The floor was covered in steel gray carpets, and the walls were painted jet black. Incandescent bulbs with dark red glass hung overhead, spread out every 20 feet or so on the dark ceiling. They cast a maze in a bloody glow. We moved forward randomly, taking turns to the left and right. There were strange obstacles in the maze, enormous chairs that looked like they were made for giants, mannequins with glowing red eyes and smooth plastic faces, and more animatronic characters, pigs and bulls and bears and roosters. The animatronics stayed still and dead, to my immense relief. As we wandered forward, I suddenly remembered something a math teacher had told me a couple of years ago, in what felt like another life. There is a way to get out of any maze without retracing your steps, the man in glasses had said at the front of the classroom, drawing a small maze as an example on the whiteboard. All you have to do is take your left hand, hold it out to your side, and keep it against the wall. Keep going forward in the maze with your hand kept against the same wall, and eventually you will find the exit. I told Alex about this. A wan smile spread across his lips. That's a good idea, he said. I never heard that before. But what if there's no exit? I shrugged. Then who cares? We'll still explore the entire maze, as long as you keep one hand on the wall, I said. It doesn't matter if it's the right hand or the left hand, just as long as you keep following the same wall. Because a maze is really just one big wall if you think about it. We continued forward around a corner. I nearly tripped over something sprawled across the hallway. I looked down and repressed a scream welling up in my throat. The mummified body of a child lay there. I couldn't tell how long it had been dead, or even whether it was a boy or a girl. The white, beady eyes of rats scurried around it, ripping off strips of the desiccated, jerky-like flesh of the corpse. The clothes were threadbare, worn away over time. The eyes stared vacantly up, as white as river stones. A smell of cinnamon and sulfur rose from the dead body. Oh my God, I said. A rising sense of panic gripping my heart. I felt it like a tightening noose around my neck. We're going to die here, aren't we? Alex didn't say anything. I heard him hyperventilating by my side under the crimson glow of the maze's lights. Did you hear something? He whispered. I was staring down at the mummified corpse, transfixed. My head jerked up as if with a will of its own. I scanned the shadowy maze. Far down the corridor, I saw the gleaming of animatronic eyes and the faded cataract light deep in the sockets, with a quiet whirring of gears. They crept towards us. A few steps later, the silhouette passed under the bare red bulb overhead. It was an animatronic minotaur with two black, bulging eyes. Its horns curled gracefully outward. A smile like a razor split its metal face. There was a squealing of metal as the jaw unhinged, roaring with an ear-splitting electronic distortion. It had legs like a rhinoceros, thick and rounded. Its silver skin reflected the bloody light as it towered over us, staring down with ferocious hatred. Run, Alex screamed, turning and sprinting away. I followed close at his heels, afraid to look back. The ground shook as the metal behemoth's heavy legs slammed the ground. We took random passageways in the maze, trying to lose the minotaur. But I could hear its heavy footsteps drawing closer by the second. Up ahead, I saw a ventilation shaft with the grill removed. A woman's face peered out, looking emaciated and filthy. In here, she hissed through gritted teeth, her words barely audible over the cacophony of the Minotaur's roaring. Her dirt-streaked face drew back, disappearing in the shadows. Alex was right behind me, and at that moment, I believed we would both make it. I leaped forward, crawling on my hands and knees into the shaft. The thin metal echoed crazily all around me as I frantically pulled myself forward. Once I had gone forward a few steps, I looked back, expecting to see Alex right behind me. He was still at the entrance, however. His eyes were wide and terrified. They met mine for a brief moment. He tried to crawl in and pull himself forward. His small hands furiously dragged over the smooth metal. Then I saw two sharp, steely hands reach down behind him, grabbing his legs. He screamed, reaching forward toward me. I tried to take his hand, but I was too far away. A single heartbeat later, he got dragged backward at a tremendous speed. A mixture of agony and mortal terror roiled across his face. "Alex," I cried, crawling forward. "Come back." A spatter of blood exploded over the wall and the end of the shaft. I turned away, crying. I heard screaming behind me, a sound like bones shattering, something slamming over and over against a wall. I crawled forward through the vents, seeing the bare silhouette of a woman ahead of me, not realizing that I would never see my brother again. "Come on," the woman whispered. The vent turned at a 90-degree angle. It was so dark that I could barely tell where I was going. I felt my way slowly forward with my hands like a blind person. "But what about my brother?" I asked. "We need to go back." "He could be hurt." The woman didn't say anything. I heard her breathing quicken. "Just follow me, kid," she said. "It's right up here." I crawled forward, seeing a square of red lights ahead of us. We came out into some kind of office room. A computer and phone sat on a desk next to crates full of protein bars and bottled water. Posters covered the walls, many of them with bizarre slogans and pictures. "Feed the bear," read one, next to a cartoon picture of an enormous animatronic bear ripping an elderly woman to pieces. Her walker lay next to her, a crumpled heap of useless metal. Her intestines were uncoiled around her, like a den of red snakes. The woman turned to me, her brown eyes set and grim. She had streaks of what looked like dried blood running through her black hair and covering her face. "Who are you?" I asked. "What are you doing here?" "My name's Sarah," she said, "and I used to work for Mr. Bittaker. I helped him build this entire underground complex. This place is massive. There are rooms for food and water, monitoring rooms, miles of mazes, and probably lots of stuff I don't know about. My name's Herbie." "So why are you here?" I said. She shook her head sadly. "When he started to go insane, when I realized he was going to put children down there as prisoners in some evil game, I tried to blow the whistle and get the authorities involved. But he was bribing some government officials, and before I knew it, the men in black ski masks broke into my house and injected me with some sort of drug. I blacked out and woke up here a few weeks ago," Sarah said. "We need to get out of here. We need to find Alex and tell people what's happening," I said. She shook her head sadly. "No one will believe us," she responded. I turned away, disgusted by her pessimism. She was supposed to be an adult, yet it seemed like she had given up all hope. I walked over to the computer, trying to turn it on. To my surprise, the screen came on with a white glare. "Hey, the computer works," I said. "Maybe we can use it to call for help." I lifted the phone to my ear, hearing a dial tone. "And the phone works. We can get out of here." "It's not going to be that easy," Sarah said glumly. I ignored her, fishing in my pocket for the card Sergeant Bowley had given me. Squinting down at it, I dialed his number. After a few rings, he picked up. "Hello," he said. In a small voice, I answered. "Hi, this is Herbie. Please, sir, you need to come back and help me. The man locked me and my brother underground, and I think my brother was hurt. There are more people down here, too. I don't know how many, and I saw a dead body." "Kid, is this a prank?" Sergeant Bowley said it quickly. "Do you know that making false reports is a crime?" Sarah grabbed the phone from me. "This isn't a prank," she pleaded. "Please, you need to come back to Bittaker's Toys and get us out of here." Larry Bitticker is insane, the phone line abruptly cut off. The power in the room went out, plunging us into darkness. Over some hidden speakers, I heard Larry Bitticker's voice ring out. "That's cheating," he growled petulantly in his high-pitched voice, sounding like an angry child. "There is no communication with the outside world. Do you know what happens to cheaters?" Sarah grabbed my hand in the darkness, whispering in my ear. "Follow me," she said. "I know this place pretty well." She led me forward. A few moments later, I heard a doorknob turn. A red light flooded into the office room. We were looking at a half-constructed part of the maze. The wires and pipes in the wall hung exposed, and only the wooden framework of the walls had been put up. "What is this?" I asked. "Is the maze not done?" "The maze is never done," Sarah answered. Larry kept expanding it, changing contractors so that no one would know the entire maze besides him. "I think he'll keep building it until the day he dies. He has enough money anyway." As quietly as we could, we moved forward through the maze, trying to put some distance between ourselves and the office room. We turned a corner with Sarah in the lead. I heard the sudden whirring of gears and a half-choked scream ahead of me. A moment later, I felt Sarah's body smash into mine. Warm blood splashed on my face as I fell backward on the ground. The wind whooshed out of my lungs. I looked up, seeing Sarah's pale, blood-spattered face staring up in horror a few feet ahead of me. A furry paw with claws like railroad spikes came down, slashing her across the chest. Drops of blood covered the walls and floor as Sarah thrashed and screamed, the animatronic bear standing over her with a dried-up husk of a face. Its fur had mostly fallen out, leaving a pale, gray bear skull leering in its place. "I'm Barry Bear," it growled in a low, slowed-down voice. "I want to be friends with you forever." "Let me give you a hug." Sarah tried to crawl away as the jet-black eyes of Barry Bear narrowed. Its jaw chattered as silver needles of teeth glistened in its metal mouth. Her eyes met mine for a moment, filled with ineffable pain and terror. I backpedaled away, scooting across the floor, my mind shell-shocked and unbelieving. The heavy body of Barry Bear came down with a force like a battering ram. Its metal arms slammed into Sarah's back, crushing her chest. Bone chips and gore exploded from her body. Blood poured out of her mouth in a rushing torrent. Her eyes rolled up in her head as she gurgled on the ground. Barry Bear's head ratcheted to face me, blood streaming down its face and arms. Its teeth chattered faster, as if to show its increasing excitement and bloodlust. "Can I give you a hug?" it growled. "No." "Get away from me," I screamed, pushing myself up to my feet. I ran randomly through the maze, hearing the heavy steps of Barry Bear close at my heels. At the far end of the half-constructed maze, I saw a thick wooden door. "Help me," I shrieked over and over. To my surprise, I heard a response from the other side of the door. "Stand back," Kid, a deep voice said. Then there was a gunshot. The door's lock exploded inward. The door shot open as someone kicked it, flinging it hard against the wall. I saw Sergeant Bowley standing there, his pistol drawn, his dead eyes flickering over the maze. They widened when they saw Barry Bear only a few footsteps behind me, closing the distance with every second. "Get down," he cried. I threw myself on the ground without question as he opened fire. The ear-splitting racket of the gunshots reverberated all across the maze. I continued crawling forward towards Sergeant Bowley, towards safety. I saw more cops running in behind him. I looked up, seeing Barry Bear sprinting towards Sergeant Bowley in a blur, its animatronic face half blown away and revealing the steel underneath. It had an insane expression of manic bloodlust. It raised its right hand, the gleaming metal claws hanging over Sergeant Bowley's head. Everything seemed to freeze then. Sergeant Bowley had his gun up. Frantically, he fired one last shot at the bear's face. The top of its head blew off as its claw came down, ripping through Sergeant Bowley's head with a crack. The scalp hung down in a sick, wet flap as his brains leaked out of his broken skull. Slowly, he fell back. Barry Bear followed him down with a tearing of metal, and a slowing of gears, and its mechanical voice. The heavy animatronic landed on top of Sergeant Bowley's body, crushing him instantly. A spreading pool of blood marked the site of the horrific murder. Screaming and crying, I crawled towards the police. They carried me outside, under a sky the color of wet cotton. I breathed in the clean air, looking around frantically for any signs of my brother. The police carried other emaciated, frightened-looking children out of the maze, but not Alex. They put me in the back of a car and drove me out of there, away from Bittaker's toys and the nightmares that waited underneath. Always check for your shadow. Mom taught us one rule: always check for your shadow. Every few hours, the three of us, Mom, Curly, and me, would do a shadow check. It was as second nature as taking a sip of water. Shadow check, my mom would call, and we'd both look down, checking that our shadow was still there. I thought everyone did this. We were homeschooled, so no one really told me otherwise. And my one friend down the block, Samantha, was a little strange herself, so she never seemed to notice. But then Mom got a job, and Curly and I went to school. And that's when everything collapsed. "What are you doing?" Paige asked me as we stood outside for recess one cool fall afternoon. "Shadow check," I replied. "Do." "Shadow check?" she asked, confused. "What's that?" I squinted at her. "You don't know what a shadow check is?" It was like she told me she didn't know how to brush her teeth. I explained slowly, in simple terms, like I was talking to a baby. You look at the ground to check your shadow is still there. She obediently looked at the ground. There it is. Then she raised her arms out in front of her and linked them, making her shadow look like the letter P. Look, it's like P for Paige. In no time at all, half the class was doing it. We'd bound out for recess, and someone would shout, "Shadow check." The kids would contort their bodies into weird shapes to make their shadows look like elephants, cats, or letters. And we'd try to guess what they were. That went on nicely for about 3 days. Then horror struck. On Thursday afternoon, it was overcast. "Shadow check," Thomas shouted. I diligently looked down and saw my shadow. But when I looked up, I realized nobody else had a shadow. For a second, I wanted to panic and scream and run. But then I took a deep breath and did exactly what my mom taught me. I grabbed Paige first. "Hey," she protested. But I didn't listen. I held on with a vice grip and started pulling her back towards the school. When the shadow goes away, hide in darkness for a day, the mantra echoed in my head. The school had a basement. I'd heard the teachers mention it. The basement would be safe. All we had to do was stay there until the morning. "Let go of me," Paige screeched, finally yanking her wrist out of my grasp. "What's wrong with you?" "What's wrong with you?" I screamed back. "We have to hide." The kids weren't smiling anymore. They were staring at me, backing away like I was a rabid animal. "We have to hide," I screamed again. "All the shadows are gone." I grabbed at Paige again, but she dodged this time. I lost my footing and fell onto the asphalt. Pain stung my knees. I looked up at my classmates. Why aren't they hiding? "What are you doing?" "Run," I screamed. That's when a teacher helped me up and took me right to the principal's office. I should have explained more clearly. My mother told me that night as she tucked me in. "The shadow thing is only for us. It's okay if other people don't have shadows." "Why?" Sadness flashed across her face for a second. Then she shook her head. "That's just the way it is." No one talked to me at recess anymore. Not even Paige. I sat alone all the time. I noticed now that there were many days in some classrooms, even when people didn't have shadows. I always did, but they didn't. Months passed, and eventually the kids forgot about the incident. That's what kids do, forget. Sometimes I wish forgiving and forgetting were easier for adults. Paige would run up to me at recess, and we'd play hopscotch. She never brought up the fact that even on an overcast day, my shadow still danced across the chalk lines, mirroring my own movements. Except sometimes they were the slightest bit out of sync, like my shadow was moving on a split-second delay. As I got older, however, things got more complicated. In 7th grade science, the teacher taught us about the sun, optics, and light, prisms and rainbows and the cones and rods in our eyes. And she mentioned that our shadow was just the absence of light, that our bodies were blocking out the sun or the overhead fluorescent lights. It didn't make sense to me then that my shadow or anyone else's would be able to disappear. If the lighting didn't change and I didn't move, how could a shadow suddenly disappear? Curly was now old enough to insist we called her by her real name, but she was still too young to understand the argument I had with my mom that night. "It's not possible," I shouted as she worked on her coloring book upstairs. "You're lying to me." "I'm not lying to you," my mother pleaded. "Yes, you are." I ran across the living room to get in my mom's face. I walked right past the ornate glass lamp that stood on the end table. My mom's eyes widened. She looked at the ground. And that's when I realized my shadow was gone. The lamp was behind me. My shadow should have been on the floor in front of me, but it wasn't. "Run," she whispered. When I didn't move, she began to shout, "Go to Curly. Go." I hesitated for half a second. Then I sprinted for the stairs. "Turn off the light," she shouted after me. I darted in and closed the door. Then I bent down and yanked out the plug for the lamp. "Hey," Curly said. "I'm coloring," Shy whispered. "And what?" My shadow disappeared. Curly was too young to remember the day her shadow disappeared. She'd only been a year old. Mom had scooped her out of the playpen, grabbed me by the hand, and took the three of us into the basement. We spent the night down there, in total darkness, eating canned beans and sleeping on old comforters laid out on the cement floor. But she knew that it was bad. She scrambled over to her bed and pulled the covers over her head. I stood in the center of the room, listening to Mom's footsteps. They never came. "Is she staying down there?" But we had so many lights on down there. It would be safer to just run to us. I crept towards the door, my heart pounding, slipping over the Barbies Curly had all over the floor. "Mom," I called out through the door. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. I could see the stairs and the light spilling out from the living room. But everything was silent. Maybe she went into the basement. A shadow appeared, cast across the wall. No, she's still down there. But no, that couldn't be my mom's shadow. It was too short. And even though the edges were blurry, the shadow sort of looked like it had a ponytail, not short hair in a pixie cut. Like my mom. That's not Mom. That's me. The blurry edges sharpened. And then the figure of the shadow came into view. My ponytail, my upturned nose, and my knocked knees. The thing crouched down and pulled at something, yanking it, moving as completely independent of me. A dragging sound. My mother's feet came into view. Still and lifeless. I gasped. My hand clapped to my mouth, but it was too late. The shadow froze. He turned to stare directly at me. And then, with huge sloping strides, it started up the stairs. I slammed the door shut. I clicked the lock. Then I jumped under the covers with Curly, my entire body trembling. The police never found Mom's body. She was eventually declared legally dead. Curly and I were sent away to live with our grandparents. They didn't seem to know anything about the shadow. They never asked us to do shadow checks. The only remark in 10 years was my grandma, on a particularly cloudy day, remarking how strange it was that I cast a perfect shadow on the sidewalk in front of us. I watched it as I walked and noticed its movements weren't perfectly in sync with my own. As the years went by and my shadow didn't disappear again, I started to get complacent. I checked for it less and less frequently. I started to lead a normal life after getting hired as a real estate agent. Curly, now going by her name Rebecca, is 19 and in college. I even started to persuade myself that my shadow didn't kill her. My mom ran away after our fight, and my memory of the shadow was my way of coping with it. Because it was harder to accept that my mom had abandoned us than it was to accept that an evil shadow had killed her. That's what I told myself until tonight. As I sat down on my computer to finish writing a house listing, I noticed there was no shadow of my fingers on the keyboard. There was no shadow on the linoleum under the desk. I ran to turn off all the lights. But I don't think I was fast enough. Because when I ran to close the blinds to block out the light from the street lamp below, I saw my shadow. I was walking across the dark street, disappearing into the night. So please, I beg you, if you see any strange shadows in your home or outside something you don't think is cast by the lights or by the objects in your home, something that looks different, hide somewhere pitch dark where no shadows can be cast until morning. Shadows on the wall. Growing up, I was convinced I'd be abducted by aliens. I lived in constant sleep-deprived fear, as every strange shadow and every reflection of light on the wall signified the beginning of what I knew would be my end. Logic told me the shadows were just piles of dirty clothes, or my coat rack, the reflections were just from passing cars on the street below. But logic fails in the face of terror. If it weren't for my older brother Jason, with whom I shared the bedroom, there was a very real chance I would have lost my mind. I remember my 13th birthday with the same detached sense of helpless violation as a victim of sexual assault. The day itself had been fine, pleasant even. My parents, who were always caring and supportive, did their best to make sure my birthday was enjoyable. They knew I was stressed. They knew I was anxious. I'd never told them why, though. Only Jason knew, and he promised to keep it a secret. After the festivities, I went up to my room to play video games. I had 2 hours to play before lights out. Jason sat on his immaculately made bed, which was in stark contrast to my messy one, and watched, offering pointers as I died over and over. 2 hours went by quickly, and Dad came in to say it was time to go to sleep. He sat next to Jason on the bed and let me know he was proud of me, how I'd been brave despite having a hard time, and that things would get better. He wished me a happy birthday and kissed me goodnight, switching off the light on his way out of the room. For a little while, I felt pretty good. Like I said, I never told my parents exactly what had been bothering me. They'd ask every so often, but they wouldn't pry. They could tell I was struggling. I heard them cleaning up downstairs, comforted by the fact that they were still awake and alert. With a sense of security I hadn't felt in a long time, I drifted off to sleep. After a couple of hours, I woke up and glanced at the clock. 11:26. I closed my eyes again. Before I could drift off to sleep, though, I noticed something. The room smelled bad. It wasn't a scent I could identify in the slightest. It was heavy and medicinal, but organic too. Strange. Alien. My eyelids lifted at the sight of something shuffling toward my bed. I tried to shout and bolt away, but nothing worked. No movement, no sound. Only my eyes could receive my commands, and they stared, bulging out of my skull as something stood over my supine body. I knew it'd finally come to me. This was the day I'd anticipated and dreaded for years. I tried to make out the features on its face. All I could pick up on was hideousness, deformity, a head with its upper left quadrant missing, a mouth with no lower mandible, and a shriveled tongue lolling down to its skinny neck. Robbie, it gurgled. It knew my name. It had been studying me, and it knew my name. No more me, Robbie. No more me. Time to grow up. Its head came down and touched my forehead with the remains of its upper lip. As it tilted, maggots tumbled out of the cratered skull and landed on my face. They squirmed and tumbled onto my pillow. I felt them writhing against my ears and the sides of my neck. I'll miss you. It turned and walked toward Jason's bed. I tried over and over to scream as panic suffused the entirety of my being. The dark world around me blurred, and I knew I was going to pass out. I knew I was going to fail my brother and not be able to warn him before the creature reached him. Before I lost consciousness, before I passed into a dreamless morass of black, I hated myself for being so useless, for being so weak. My mother's shrill, panicked shriek catapulted me back into reality. The room was bright. It was morning. Mom stood over Jason's bed, wailing and sobbing, and I heard Dad thundering across the hall from their bedroom. He burst into the room and immediately saw what Mom had done. I watched his knees tremble as if he were about to fall. I didn't move. Everything from the night was coming back, and I knew I was certain that Jason was dead. My big brother was gone. The certainty was overwhelming, and searing tears leaked down my cheeks onto the pillow. Something wriggled against my neck. I gasped and leaped to my feet. Everything went slowly for the next few minutes. I turned and saw the ring of maggots around my head printed on the pillow. Dad was crossing the room to take me in his arms when he saw the bugs on my pillow and in my hair and whispered, "Oh my God," he picked me up. He hadn't done that in years. I rode out of the room in his strong arms. "Don't look at your brother's bed," he ordered. I couldn't help myself. I looked as we exited. One glance was all I needed. Jason's body was on the bed. He was wearing a stained and dirt-encrusted blue suit. Oh no, I thought to myself as I took in his injuries: the torn lower mandible, the caved-in skull. The desiccated green-gray skin was mostly gone. Mom's racking sobs had escalated to hysterical screaming. As Dad and I rounded the corner and headed downstairs, we heard her shouting, "How did you come back? Why are you here? Who did this?" Dad whispered in my ear as we walked. "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay. We don't know who did it, but it's going to be all right. It's not your brother anymore. It's just the body he doesn't need. He's still in heaven, okay? He's still in heaven." I started to shake, and Dad's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke those last words. "He's in heaven." It sounded horribly, horribly familiar. I closed my eyes and saw a coffin. I saw my parents standing next to it, sobbing. I saw a large framed picture of Jason and a room full of friends and family. But I also saw the toys I was playing with. And I saw Jason sitting next to me. We played while everyone else cried. He grinned and said, "Don't be upset, Robbie. I'll be here to help while you grow up. You don't have to feel sad." My aunt, Lindsay, came up to me and stood in the exact same spot where Jason was sitting. I remember thinking it was strange she could do that. And then she knelt down and said, "He's in heaven," before walking back to my cousins and uncle. Jason winked at my confused face. Then we kept playing with our toys. "Jason died," I whispered to Dad. He nodded, and I watched as he eyed the muddy footprints from the back door, which led up the hall and up the stairs to my room. "You were probably too young to remember, but he loved you so much." I thought back to all the fun we'd had in our room over the years, all leading up to the video games on my 13th birthday the night before. "You're the same age he was now," Dad said, and tears freely flowed down his beard. "You're all grown up." Something from the previous night buzzed in my ear. "No more me, Robbie. No more me. Time to grow up." And then it clicked, and my screams joined those of my mother in a terrible, dissonant chorus.